As most of you know, Supercell is a company that made Clash of Clans along with many other massive games. They really were seen as one of the best game companies out there. However, that sentiment is starting to change and we can clearly see that. In just the last few months, Supercell has gone through many different controversies with their major games and people are starting to paint them out as some greedy and evil game company. And today, I just want to go over a lot of the bigger controversies that have happened somewhat recently and what that shows about the company, since it is starting to become concerning now. So let's quickly just go over the beginning of controversy, which would have been with the downfall of Clash Royale, which started around 2020. Before this period, I would say that Supercell was seen as a pretty clean company that was very focused on the growth of their games and the happiness of their players. Obviously, there were little controversies, but nothing really too major. The only major thing that would have happened before 2020 was with Tencent getting a majority share of Supercell, and I personally believe this has been the reason for a lot of the controversies and bad decisions taken by the company, but we'll get more into that later in this video. But anyways, 2020 would be where people would really start to notice things weren't exactly going all that well, as there were countless bad decisions being made with Clash Royale, which was arguably their biggest game at the time, with it surpassing Clash of Clans. And if you look at the state of Clash Royale now, then you can clearly see how the game isn't doing well, and it has really just become the most hated Supercell game, and it is playing a big part in bringing down the company since people associate Supercell with Clash Royale, and by seeing how that game is essentially falling apart, it isn't a good look for the company as a whole. And if we had to look at some specific examples, then there are really like 3 that just really stand out to me and that I want to go over. First of all, you had the addition of the champions, and more specifically the monk as well as the phoenix card, and these were cards that were just really broken upon launch, and that made the game very pay to win, and this would really be like an early example of this happening, and we have even seen how it is kind of happening in Brawl Stars, but we'll get to that later in the video. After the champions, you also had another similar situation with the tower troops, and more specifically the Dagger Duchess, as that was just a really broken card and it was super expensive to buy, and it was even worse than what we are seeing inside of Brawl Stars. Those 2 examples really show the more greedy side of Supercell and what they have come under fire for the most. However, the third situation I wanted to point out was the one with the lucky drops. These were things that were supposed to be a treat to the players, and people ended up finding out a way to be able to see what was in the drop without collecting it, and this way they could basically roll as many times as they wanted until they got what they wanted. This was a relatively harmless glitch in my opinion, and it was like one time where people were able to actually get something for free. However, despite all that, Supercell decided to just go and ban a bunch of the players that did this, and that was seen as just very unfair and very excessive. It showed how Supercell was willing to give the max punishment for something that affected the game economy, but they would do pretty much nothing against people using exploits and bugs inside of actual matches that counted for trophies, and that affected the core gameplay of the game. This showed where Supercell had their priorities, and it was just a massive deal because it wasn't a good look for the company. In the end, the players did end up getting unbanned, however that was after all the backlash, and that is a pattern we just pretty much always see when it comes to controversies. And I mean, we could just go on for days about how Supercell just ruined Clash Royale, so let's switch over to a different topic that I hear a lot, and that is with the developer teams. One thing that Supercell is very well known for is that they essentially just have individual teams in charge of each game, and that is partly a reason as for why we see so many different games get treated in different ways, and really just how one company can be so different from game to game. Like the Brawl Stars team is very engaged with the community, meanwhile we have pretty much heard nothing from the community managers at Clash of Clans after Darian left. This does show how reliant games can be on just a couple of people. However, despite them all being in smaller teams, it is reasonable to assume that there is quite a bit of oversight from Supercell, and more specifically Tencent, because they own a majority of the company and have a large say in what goes on. But going back to developer teams, I definitely do believe that these individual teams are a big reason for why the games are so different, but I also don't think that it is a reason to just excuse Supercell by putting the blame on a couple of developers, because at the end of the day, the games have the Supercell brand and Supercell should have the final say in what happens, along with Tencent. Also, I know I keep on mentioning Tencent, but I promise it'll become a lot more relevant later in the video. But now let's move on to Brawl Stars, since this is definitely one of the more interesting games. This game has really been like the golden child for Supercell recently, with it just doing extremely well, but we have also seen some different things happening over the last few months that makes the game seem less ideal than before. First of all, brawlers are being released as early access for real money, and these brawlers also tend to just be really strong and pretty much pay to win, as you have an edge on the competition by buying the brawler in early access. And this is definitely a really strong thing that does show how Brawl Stars is trying to make more money, and another kind of similar thing is just making the Brawl Pass cost real money instead of gems, which basically makes it inaccessible to free-to-play players. Now, the impact of the Brawl Pass is debatable. However, the early access brawlers is definitely a thing that is a lot more controversial, but it is just something players are starting to accept now. And I would say that is really about it for the more major things with Brawl Stars, but it definitely seems to be slipping a little bit by becoming a bit more pay to win. And then as for Clash of Clans, well, we had a big controversy very recently with the gold pass reward being a decoration instead of a skin. This was really like a pretty big deal, and there was a lot of outrage, and the devs caved in really quickly with them adding the Warden skin to the pass along with some extra rewards to help and make up for it. And this is actually a pretty important thing because it shows how the devs are actually listening, and they managed to basically fix things relatively quickly, and they also tried to make it better, which is something we don't see all that often. Normally the players either get ignored or the problem gets fixed and just left at that, but this time we got some extra rewards, which was a nice thing, and that led to people actually liking Supercell for doing this. But outside of that, we definitely do have a bit more serious of a problem when it comes to Clash of Clans and Supercell in general, and that is really with the game security. Clash of Clans has a massive account stealing problem, and a few weeks ago there was this post on Reddit by one of the account stealers that just highlighted this whole problem, but more specifically talked about how there were corrupt employees that would actually sell people's information and how that led to people getting hacked. And this was really like a very important and valuable insight into the whole account stealing problem. This highlights big problems just within the company itself, and I think that is definitely a big problem that they need to address, assuming the information is true. But outside of that, I think Supercell is doing alright. However, things definitely do feel a bit different now with the company and their games, and I don't know if that's just because I'm older now or if it's the company itself, or maybe even a mix of both. But anyways, another thing I want to talk a bit more about is Tencent, since I mentioned them earlier in this video. In case you didn't know, this is just a massive company that actually owns quite a lot of the gaming space and owns many other big publishers, and I would personally say that Tencent has a monopoly on the market, and they are also a company that is just driven by profits. This is most likely a big factor when it comes to a lot of the more controversial decisions that Supercell makes when it comes to their games, and I think it is just something to think about to see how things may look in the future as Supercell continues to be majority owned by Tencent. But also, another thing I want to point out is that Heyday and Boom Beach haven't really seemed to fall victim to Tencent, or I suppose anything that has happened in the other Supercell games. This could be because those games just aren't as popular or mainstream as the three other main games that we have mainly talked about so far. I mean, I guess there is no point trying to do anything with Boom Beach, as that game is pretty dead. And then with Heyday, you just have a really casual audience that is almost like detached from all the other Supercell games, so that could be a reason as for why that game doesn't really seem to be affected by any of the greed or anything that seems to have affected the other games. But we obviously don't know for sure right now. However, I thought I would bring that up to show how Supercell isn't like all bad and how it's not like all of their games have been affected, though it is the three main ones that were affected. But at the end of the day, all of these games are still doing pretty well when compared to most other games out there. We can only just hope that Supercell as a company does improve after this point, since it does seem like they were slipping with them, just having a bunch more controversies and issues than usual. However, this is still one of the biggest and most impactful game companies out there, and it would take a lot for them to truly go down or anything remotely close to that. I still love this company, but I thought I would just highlight how it was doing at this moment, since I think it is important to look at Supercell as a whole rather than the individual companies, because that is really important. But that is also it for this video. I really do hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.